One flight turned a luxurious journey into a battleground of prejudice, but a single revelation flipped the script, leaving everyone stunned. What happens when a flight attendant's bias meets the owner of the airline? Prepare for a story of justice that'll leave you inspired. The private jet gleamed under the late afternoon sun on a tarmac in Atlanta, Georgia, its sleek design a promise of luxury for the elite passengers boarding. Inside, the cabin exuded opulence: plush beige leather seats, polished wood accents, and the faint scent of citrus lingering in the air, a touch of exclusivity that whispered comfort and prestige. Soft ambient music played as passengers settled in, their designer luggage rolling behind them, their voices a low hum of anticipation. Sunlight streamed through the rounded windows, casting golden streaks across the carpeted floor, a detail that spoke of meticulous care, creating an atmosphere of refined elegance that felt almost otherworldly. Marcus Everett, a black man in his early 40s, stepped into the cabin, his presence understated yet commanding, a composed confidence radiating from him. Dressed in a charcoal blazer and matching trousers, he moved with purpose, his leather loafers tapping against the carpet, each step a testament to the journey that had brought him here. He carried a simple briefcase, its worn edges a stark contrast to the polished surroundings, the leather scuffed from years of use, a detail that spoke of hard work rather than inherited wealth, of late nights spent building a dream from nothing. Marcus's dark eyes swept the cabin, taking in every detail: the shimmer of a diamond bracelet on a passenger's wrist, the smooth efficiency of the crew, the warm glow of the wood under the sunlight. Before he settled into his seat near the front, his posture relaxed, but his gaze piercing, a man who had learned to navigate the world with both caution and determination. He was on his way to oversee a new acquisition for Everett Airlines, the company he'd built from the ground up, a dream born in the cramped apartment where his father's stories of resilience had fueled his ambition, where the sound of his father's tired sighs after a long shift had been a constant reminder of sacrifice. But no one on board knew his true identity, and Marcus preferred it that way, wanting to experience the service without the influence of his title, to see if the values he'd instilled, respect, dignity, fairness, were truly upheld, or if they were just empty promises. He adjusted his tie, glancing out the window at the ground crew on the tarmac, their orange vests bright against the asphalt, a reminder of the countless people who kept this operation running, people whose labor he'd vowed to honor with a company that treated everyone with respect. Marcus's thoughts drifted to the early days of Everett Airlines, when he'd worked out of a tiny office with peeling paint, his only company a flickering desk lamp, and a stack of rejection letters from investors who couldn't see past his background to the vision he carried in his heart. He'd faced skepticism at every turn, from bank managers who doubted his potential to industry veterans who smirked at his ambition. But he'd persisted, driven by his father's belief in him. The man who had worked as a janitor to put food on the table, whose rough hands had held Marcus's face as he'd said, "You're meant for more, son. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise." That memory was a fire in Marcus's chest, burning even now, as he sat in this jet, surrounded by luxury he'd fought to create. Luxury that should have been a celebration, but was already being tainted by the shadow of prejudice. Sarah Bennett, the lead flight attendant in her late 30s, stood near the entrance, her crisp blue uniform tailored to perfection, the silver pin on her lapel catching the light, a symbol of her authority. Her blonde hair was pulled into a tight bun, a detail that matched her stern demeanor, her green eyes scanning each passenger with scrutiny, her judgment swift, a habit honed over years of serving the wealthy, where appearances often dictated treatment. As Marcus boarded, Sarah's smile faltered, her eyes narrowing as she took in his appearance, the practical briefcase, the understated blazer, the composed confidence that didn't fit her image of an elite passenger. "Welcome aboard," she said curtly, her voice cold compared to the warmth she offered the couple behind him, the Thompsons, a pair of seasoned travelers in their 50s, their pearls and tailored suits screaming old money, their presence the kind Sarah was trained to cater to. Sarah's tone brightened for them. "Mr. and Mrs. Thompson, so lovely to see you again," as she ushered them to their seats with a flourish, her movements graceful, almost performative. Mrs. Thompson nodded graciously, her pearl necklace glinting, while Mr. Thompson offered a polite smile, his newspaper tucked under his arm. Marcus noticed the contrast, a faint pang stirring in his chest, a familiar sting of being judged before he could speak, a sting he'd felt too many times in spaces where his worth was measured by the color of his skin. But he said nothing, his expression composed as he adjusted his briefcase under his seat, the worn leather grounding him, a reminder of the journey that had taught him to let his actions speak louder than his words. A young woman in a silk scarf sipped champagne a few rows back, her laughter light as she shared a story, while an older man in a pinstripe suit read a leather-bound book, his focus unwavering, seemingly unaware of the dynamics unfolding. The first sign of trouble came as Sarah moved through the cabin, her heels clicking against the carpet, her clipboard in hand, her expression tight, a tension brewing behind her composed facade. She paused near Marcus, her lips pressing into a thin line as she glanced at him, her green eyes carrying a silent judgment. "Excuse me, sir," she said, her tone dripping with condescension, her words cutting through the hum of the cabin. "I believe you're in the wrong seat. This area is reserved for our most valued guests." The accusation hung in the air, a subtle assault on Marcus's presence, a reminder of the barriers he'd fought to overcome. Marcus looked up, his gaze unwavering, his voice even, a composure that belied the turmoil inside him. "I'm in the right seat," he replied, handing her his boarding pass, his fingers firm, a small act of defiance in the face of her doubt, a defiance forged through years of facing such moments. Sarah's eyebrows arched, her irritation clear as she scanned the pass, her fingers tightening around the paper. "I'll double-check the list," she muttered, her tone suggesting she didn't believe him, her heels clicking as she walked away, leaving a sting of humiliation that settled heavily on Marcus's shoulders, a burden he'd carried too often, a burden that challenged the vision he'd built Everett Airlines to embody. He thought of his father's words, "You'll have to work twice as hard, but don't let that stop you." Marcus had created Everett Airlines to ensure respect for all, but Sarah's actions were a direct challenge to that vision, a challenge he couldn't ignore. A spark of resolve ignited in his chest, the hum of the plane's engines matching the even beat of his heart, a rhythm of resilience, a promise that justice would find a way. Sarah returned, her expression a mix of irritation and suspicion, her clipboard clutched tightly, her knuckles pale from the force of her grip, her green eyes flashing with determination. She stood over Marcus, her voice sharp, carrying an edge that echoed through the cabin, slicing through the ambient hum. "I've checked the list and there's a mistake," she said, her tone loud enough for others to hear, her words laced with disdain, each syllable meant to mark Marcus as an outsider. "This area is for our most valued guests. You'll need to move to the back." Marcus remained composed, his hands resting on his lap, his eyes holding a firm resolve that made Sarah's gaze waver. A crack in her armor she tried to hide. "I've shown you my boarding pass," he said, his voice firm, a defiance that reverberated through the cabin, a challenge to her authority she couldn't ignore. "I'm not moving." Sarah's face flushed with anger, her arms crossing as she leaned closer, her tone biting, her blonde bun catching the light as she tilted her head in contempt, her green eyes narrowing into slits. "I don't know how you got this seat, but I know who belongs here. And it's not you." Hacking at Patty for squalid grandeur. She snapped, her words a blatant accusation, her prejudice laid bare. A declaration that hung in the air, heavy with the burden of unchecked bias, pressing down on Marcus's chest, threatening to unravel the calm he'd worked to maintain. Marcus's jaw tightened, a trace of hurt crossing his face. But he didn't flinch, his composure a rebuke to her aggression, a strength forged through years of facing such moments, a strength that reminded him of his father's words, whispered after a long shift. "Never let them see you break, son. Your strength is your shield." Those words anchored him, a reminder that he was more than her assumptions, more than the worn briefcase beneath his seat, a briefcase that held the blueprints of a dream she couldn't understand. Marcus had built Everett Airlines to be a beacon of fairness, and Sarah's actions were an assault on that vision, an assault he couldn't let stand. Nearby passengers noticed the exchange, the tension thickening like a fog. The Thompsons, a few rows back, exchanged a glance, Mrs. Thompson clutching her pearl necklace, her brow furrowing with concern, while Mr. Thompson lowered his newspaper, his gray eyes narrowing, sensing the injustice unfolding. Across the aisle, Ryan Carter, a young tech entrepreneur in his late 20s dressed in a casual blazer, glanced over, his brow furrowing at Sarah's tone, his hazel eyes darkening with doubt, a hint of recognition as he recalled his own experiences with bias, moments that had taught him the sting of judgment. Ryan set down his tablet, his fingers hovering over the screen, a silent question in his gaze as he wondered how far this would go. Sarah turned to the others, her voice rising with a theatrical flair, her movements sharp, her gaze darting to Marcus with disdain. "We have rules for a reason," she said, her words a rallying cry to justify her actions, to paint Marcus as the problem. "Some people just don't respect them." The cabin fell into an uneasy silence, the hum of the engines a constant pulse that underscored the gravity of her words, a gravity that made it hard to look away, hard to ignore the injustice unfolding. A spark of hope emerged amidst the tension, a faint light in the gathering conflict. Grace, a junior flight attendant in her early 20s, stood near the galley, her dark hair tied back in a loose ponytail, her brown eyes wide with nervousness, her heart pounding as she watched the exchange. Grace had been with Everett Airlines for 6 months, and in that time, she'd seen Sarah's unfairness, a sharp word to a new crew member, a dismissive glance at a passenger who didn't fit her mold, a pattern Grace had vowed not to emulate, hoping to make a difference, even a small one. Her fingers trembled as she clutched a tray of drinks, the glassware clinking softly, her instincts urging her to act, her conscience whispering that this wasn't right, that Marcus deserved better. She took a tentative step forward, her sneakers silent against the carpet, her voice a whisper as she addressed Sarah, her tone earnest, a subtle rebellion against Sarah's authority. "Should we double-check the list again?" she asked, her words a plea for fairness, a hope that the truth might shift the tide. Sarah's head snapped toward her, her glare icy, her lips curling into a sneer. "I've got this under control, Grace," she snapped, her tone cutting, a warning that made Grace's face flush with embarrassment, her cheeks burning as she lowered her gaze, her hands tightening around the tray, her heart racing with a mix of shame and resolve, a resolve that lingered despite Sarah's wrath. Grace's small act planted a seed of doubt in the cabin, a sign that not everyone agreed with Sarah's judgment, a glimmer of hope for justice, a reminder that there were those who would stand for what was right, even if their voices trembled. Grace stepped back, her brown eyes darting to Marcus with sympathy, her gesture a subtle defiance that Marcus noticed, a warmth igniting in his chest, a reminder that he wasn't entirely alone, that kindness could pierce through prejudice. The situation escalated as Sarah, visibly frustrated, gestured toward the back, her movements sharp, her voice dripping with condescension, her blonde bun slightly askew, a sign of her unraveling composure. "If you don't move now, I'll call security," she said, drawing gasps from the Thompsons, Mrs. Thompson's hand flying to her mouth, her voice a soft whisper to her husband. "This is getting out of hand." Marcus tilted his head, his demeanor unwavering, his eyes meeting Sarah's with a resolute authority that made her pause, a trace of doubt crossing her face as she sensed a strength she couldn't place, a strength that unsettled her. "Call whoever you need to," he said softly, his voice carrying a gravity that filled the cabin, a promise that this was far from over, a promise of justice that would not be denied. Sarah scoffed, her confidence a fragile mask, her heels clicking as she stormed to the front, a crack in her facade that Marcus noticed, his gaze following her retreat with a focused intensity, his heart resolute, a pulse of resilience that spoke of a legacy that refused to be silenced. The passengers' murmurs grew louder, the older man in the pinstriped suit glancing up from his book, his attention now engaged, a silent witness to the unfolding drama, a moment that would leave its mark on everyone on board. Marcus sat back, the sting of Sarah's words lingering, but a spark of hope burned in his chest, fueled by Grace's defiance. a light that gave him strength to stand tall, a legacy of resilience from his father that would carry him through, no matter how loud the voices of prejudice tried to shout it down. Sarah stormed back down the aisle, her face set with determination, her polished heels striking the carpet with a rhythm that matched her rising frustration, a tray of sparkling water balanced in her hands. She served the Thompsons first, her smile forced as she handed them their drinks, her voice tinged with a hollow sweetness that clashed with her earlier hostility. She moved to other passengers, her movements brisk, deliberately bypassing Marcus, her green eyes avoiding his seat as if he were invisible, a silent continuation of her disdain. Marcus watched her, his gaze composed but piercing, a resolve building in his chest, a fire kindled by years of facing such dismissals. After several minutes he spoke, his tone gentle but firm, cutting through the cabin's hum. "Excuse me, could I have some water, please?" he asked, his voice even, a simple request that carried the weight of his dignity. Sarah paused mid-step, her shoulders tensing, her lips curling into a sneer as she glanced at him, her expression brimming with contempt. "I'll get to you when I can," she snapped, her voice cutting, her words a dismissal as she walked past, the tray nearly empty as she moved to the back, her heels clicking with defiance that echoed through the cabin. Marcus's jaw tightened, a pang of frustration stirring in his chest, a familiar feeling from years of being overlooked, a feeling he'd vowed to eradicate when he built Everett Airlines, a vow now tested by Sarah's actions. He adjusted his posture, his hands resting on his lap, his composure a shield against the humiliation she sought to inflict, a shield forged through countless battles that had taught him to stand tall. The situation took a shocking turn as Sarah returned, her keen eyes catching Marcus stretching his legs slightly into the aisle, a natural adjustment after sitting for so long. Her movements were calculated, her path altered as if to create a confrontation, her frustration now a driving force. In an instant, her foot struck Marcus's leg, the tray tilted, and the remaining glasses of water tumbled forward, splashing onto his lap and the floor, the cold liquid seeping through his trousers. Sarah gasped, her voice loud and accusing, a performance meant for the other passengers. "Watch where you're putting your legs, you've caused a mess," she exclaimed, her tone piercing, her words a blatant attempt to shift blame, to paint Marcus as the problem, the outsider. Passengers turned their heads, their eyes wide with shock at the commotion, the Thompsons exchanging a glance, Mrs. Thompson's fingers tightening around her pearl necklace. Marcus looked up, his trousers soaked, the water dripping onto the carpet, but his composure remained intact, his hands brushing at the liquid with steady precision, a precision that spoke of a man who had faced worse. "You walked into my leg," he said simply, his voice even, his dark eyes meeting hers with unyielding strength, a strength that made Sarah falter, her confidence wavering. But her frustration boiled over, her face flushing with anger as she stepped closer, her voice rising. "I've had enough of this," she snapped, her tone reverberating through the cabin. "You think you can talk to me like that? People like you don't belong here." Her words hung in the air, a blatant display of bias that drew gasps from the passengers, a collective intake of breath that left behind a heavy stillness. Ryan Carter, the tech entrepreneur, leaned forward, his brow furrowing with disbelief, his hazel eyes darkening with anger, his hands gripping the armrests. Grace, standing near the galley, bit her lip, her hands trembling as she clutched her tray, the glassware clinking softly, a sound that mirrored the turmoil in her chest, torn between fear and the urge to act, her heart racing as she witnessed the injustice unfolding. Then, in a moment that stunned the cabin into silence, Sarah raised her hand and slapped Marcus across the face, the sound echoing like a thunderclap, a crack that silenced every whisper, a boundary shattered. Marcus's cheek stung, a sharp pain radiating through his face, but he didn't flinch, his gaze unwavering, his dark eyes burning with a quiet fury, a fury tempered by resilience, a fury that promised consequences. Ryan stood halfway, his face a mask of outrage, his voice low but firm as he muttered, "She can't do that," his words a quiet rebellion. But amidst the shock, a pivotal moment emerged. Grace, her face pale with horror, discreetly stepped away, her fingers trembling as she pulled out her phone, her heart pounding as she dialed a number. her voice hushed but resolute. "It's Grace," she whispered, her brown eyes darting toward Marcus, a mix of fear and determination in her gaze. "We have a situation on the plane," she said, her words firm despite the tremor in her voice, a small act of courage that felt monumental, a beacon of hope that justice might prevail. She hung up, her expression a mix of worry and resolve as she returned to her post, her act a lifeline in the escalating conflict, a sign that Marcus wasn't alone, that there were those who would stand for what was right. Marcus, his cheek still stinging, straightened slowly, his hand resting on his lap, his gaze unwavering as he looked up at Sarah, his voice low but cutting, each word a promise that sent a chill down her spine. "You just made the worst mistake of your life," he said, his tone firm, laced with an authority that made Sarah hesitate, her green eyes flickering with doubt, a doubt that hinted at the reckoning to come, a reckoning that would turn this moment of humiliation into a moment of justice, a moment Marcus had been preparing for his entire life. The cabin held its breath, the strain a tangible force, a storm on the horizon, and Marcus's words were the first crack of thunder, a warning of the storm about to break. Sarah stood over Marcus, her arms crossed, her face a mask of defiance, but a growing unease gnawed at her chest, a feeling she couldn't shake as she watched Marcus remain seated, his posture composed, the water still dripping onto his trousers, a stark reminder of her earlier aggression. His expression carried a gravity that made her pause, a gravity that hinted at a power she hadn't anticipated, a power that unsettled her, even as she tried to cling to her control. The passengers watched in stunned stillness, their eyes darting between the two, the memory of the slap lingering, a wound that demanded justice. Ryan stood halfway, his face a mix of disbelief and anger, his hazel eyes burning with outrage, while Mrs. Thompson whispered to her husband, her voice trembling. "This is outrageous," her hands clasped together, as if in prayer for resolution. The cockpit door opened with a soft click, a sound that drew every eye as the pilot stepped out, his face pale, his expression tight with urgency, his uniform crisp but his demeanor uneasy. He scanned the room briefly, his gaze lingering on Marcus before settling on Sarah, his movements brisk as he walked toward her, each step a testament to the gravity of the moment. "Sarah, step aside," he said, his voice firm, laced with unease, his words cutting through the strain like a blade, a command that brooked no argument. Sarah frowned, her confusion evident as she crossed her arms tighter, her blonde bun catching the light as she tilted her head in defiance, her voice biting with indignation. "Excuse me? I'm handling this," she snapped, her words an attempt to reclaim the control she felt slipping away. The pilot's gaze flicked to Marcus, then back to Sarah, his words hitting the cabin like a thunderclap, a revelation that shifted the conflict's foundation. "I just received a call from management," he said, his voice resolute, his eyes wide with realization, his hands clasped behind his back, as if to steady himself. "The owner of this plane, and Everett Airlines, is on board. It's Mr. Everett," he said, pointing to Marcus. His words a bombshell that detonated in the stillness, a bombshell that changed everything, a bombshell that turned Sarah's world upside down. Gasps rippled through the cabin, the Thompsons audibly inhaling, their eyes widening as they looked at Marcus with newfound respect. Mr. Thompson's newspaper slipping from his lap, Mrs. Thompson's hands flying to her mouth, her gray eyes shining with awe. Ryan nodded knowingly, a faint smile tugging at his lips as he muttered under his breath, "I had a feeling." His words a quiet acknowledgement of the strength he'd sensed in Marcus, a strength he'd recognized from his own battles in the tech world. Grace let out a soft breath, her brown eyes shining with relief, a smile breaking across her face as she clutched her tray, her small act of courage now validated, filling her with hope. A hope that justice could prevail. Sarah froze, her face draining of color as the realization hit her, her earlier confidence evaporating, her hands trembling as she took a step back, her green eyes darting around the cabin, searching for an escape that wouldn't come. Searching for a reality where her actions hadn't just destroyed her future. "That can't be true," she stammered, her voice losing its usual edge, her words a desperate plea against the truth, a plea that fell on deaf ears as the passengers looked to Marcus, waiting to see how justice would be served. Marcus stood slowly, his movements deliberate, his charcoal blazer slightly wrinkled from the water, but his presence commanding, radiating a power that quieted the entire cabin, a power that spoke of years of struggle, of battles fought and won, of a man who had built an empire against all odds. He adjusted his tie, the fabric smooth under his fingers, a small act that grounded him, a reminder of who he was, of the legacy he carried, a legacy that demanded justice, a legacy that demanded change. "I'm Marcus Everett," he began, his voice resolute, his gaze sweeping across the cabin before settling on Sarah, piercing as a blade, a gaze that cut through her defenses, leaving her exposed. "I own this plane, and I own this airline, and your behavior today has been nothing short of disgraceful," he said, his words a verdict, a condemnation that left no room for argument, drawing nods from the passengers, a collective agreement that justice was being served. Sarah's mouth opened and closed, her earlier confidence replaced by panic, her green eyes wide with fear, her hands trembling as she clutched her uniform scarf, her once pristine bun unraveling, a sign of her crumbling composure, a sign that she knew the end had come. Marcus took a step closer, his tone composed but firm, his words slicing through the stillness, each one a testament to the strength she'd tried to diminish. "You didn't know because you didn't think someone like me could own a company like this," he said, his voice carrying the burden of years of struggle, of doors slammed in his face, of assumptions he'd fought to overcome, assumptions he'd vowed to dismantle, one act of justice at a time. "You judged me, humiliated me, and assaulted me in front of these passengers," he continued, his words a litany of her crimes, a litany that demanded consequences she couldn't escape. "And now, you'll face the consequences," he said, his voice a promise that sent a chill through the cabin, a promise that marked the end of Sarah's reign, the beginning of a new chapter where respect would be the standard. The cabin doors opened, and two sharply dressed assistants stepped in, their movements brisk, their presence commanding attention, their tailored suits a contrast to the chaos that had unfolded, a contrast that spoke of order, of power, of the authority Marcus wielded, an authority Sarah had underestimated. "Mr. Everett," one of them said warmly, their voice respectful, their eyes meeting Marcus's with deference, a deference that spoke of loyalty, of a shared vision for what Everett Airlines could be, a vision that would now rise stronger than ever. "Everything is ready for your review," the assistant said, their words a signal that the reckoning had begun, a signal that Sarah's fate was sealed, a signal that justice would be served, swiftly and decisively. The passengers watched in hushed awe, their phones discreetly raised, capturing the moment as Marcus delivered his final verdict, his voice resolute and unyielding, a voice that carried the burden of his journey, the burden of every person who had ever been made to feel less than, a burden that now rested on Sarah's shoulders, a burden she couldn't bear. "Sarah, you're fired, effective immediately," he said, his words a final blow, a blow that shattered her defenses, marking the end of her career, the end of her arrogance, the end of her ability to harm others with her prejudice, bringing a collective sigh of relief from the passengers. "And I'll ensure this never happens to another passenger again," Marcus added, his words a vow, a commitment to change, a commitment that left the passengers nodding in agreement, their faces a mix of admiration and gratitude, a commitment that marked the beginning of a new era for Everett Airlines, an era where respect would be the foundation, not the exception, an era Marcus had fought his entire life to create. The cabin buzzed with murmurs as Sarah's composure shattered, tears streaming down her face, her voice quivering as she stepped back, clutching her uniform scarf tightly. "Please, Mr. Everett, I didn't mean," she pleaded, her tone raw with desperation, but Marcus raised a hand, his expression firm, cutting her off with a decisive gesture. "You didn't mean to get caught," he said, his voice cold, leaving no room for excuses, reflecting a man who had endured too much to let her actions slide. "But you did, and actions have consequences," he added, his words a verdict, declaring that equity would not be denied, no matter how much she regretted her choices now. Two uniformed security officers stepped into the cabin, their presence commanding, their polished badges glinting under the overhead lights, sending whispers through the passengers, signaling that accountability was near. "Mr. Everett," one officer said, his tone respectful as he addressed Marcus, "we received your report. Are you pressing charges?" Marcus's gaze remained calm, his dark eyes unyielding as they locked onto Sarah, who seemed to shrink under his stare, her earlier defiance now a distant memory. "Yes," he said, his voice resolute, each word striking the final blow to Sarah's career. "This individual assaulted me in front of witnesses. Expect her to be held accountable," he stated, his words demanding rightness echoing through the cabin, touching every passenger who had witnessed the ordeal, bringing balance to all who had faced such bias. Sarah gasped, her hands flying to her mouth, her breathing quickening as the officers stepped forward, one producing handcuffs, the metallic click echoing louder than the plane's engines, marking the end of her reign and the start of her reckoning. "Ma'am, you're under arrest for assault," the officer said, his tone professional, reading her rights in a legal formality that sealed her fate, a ritual Sarah could not escape. Her tears flowed freely, her voice breaking as she tried to protest. "Please, Mr. Everett, I'm sorry," she sobbed, but Marcus's expression remained impassive, his resolve unshaken, his heart hardened by the memory of her slap, her words, her prejudice. "Your apology means nothing without accountability," he said, quietly, delivering a final verdict as the officers led her away, her once dominant presence now a defeated shadow, her blonde bun unraveling as she stumbled forward, revealing her downfall, a consequence she had brought upon herself. Marcus turned to the passengers, his posture composed, his voice steady as he addressed the cabin, his presence radiating strength in the aftermath of the storm. "To everyone here, I apologize for what you witnessed today," he said, his dark eyes sweeping the room, meeting each gaze with genuine concern, a concern that warmed the hearts of those watching, showing how deeply he valued the principles his airline was built on. Principles that had been tested but not broken. "Moving forward, we'll expect no discrimination, sir. This is not the standard of service I expect on my planes. Moving forward, we'll ensure every passenger is treated with dignity and honor," he affirmed, pledging change, drawing nods of approval from the passengers, easing the tension and boosting the cabin's mood with fairness. Marcus then turned to Grace, the junior flight attendant who had quietly stood by him, her face pale but her brown eyes shining with gratitude. "Grace," he said, his tone softening, his voice warm, rewarding her courage in contrast to the steel he'd shown Sarah. "I noticed your professionalism today. Thank you for stepping up when it mattered. You'll hear from my office about a promotion," he said, his words affirming her bravery, bringing a smile to her face, brightening the cabin, hinting at a future where kindness and courage were valued. Grace's smile widened as she nodded quickly, her voice trembling with emotion as she responded, "Thank you, Mr. Everett." Her words heartfelt, her hands clasping together in gratitude, sealing a bond of mutual respect between them, forged in the fire of this day's events. Marcus returned the smile, his hand extending to shake hers, the clasp symbolizing unity and a shared vision for what Everett Airlines could be, where every employee and passenger was valued and seen. As the plane prepared to take off again, Marcus settled back into his seat, the water on his trousers now a distant memory, replaced by quiet satisfaction from turning a moment of humiliation into a catalyst for change. Honoring his father, a janitor whose lessons of perseverance and integrity now guided Marcus's every decision, leading him to this new beginning. In the weeks that followed, Everett Airlines transformed under Marcus's leadership. Its staff retrained with a focus on empathy and honor, their interactions now marked by genuine warmth, a stark contrast to the coldness Marcus had faced on that fateful flight. Now a distant memory, replaced by connection, understanding, and a new standard of care. Passengers shared stories over drinks during flights, their laughter mingling with the clink of glasses, the aroma of citrus filling the air, reminding them of the airline's renewed commitment to treat everyone with dignity. a commitment that felt like victory for every traveler, employee, and person who had ever felt unseen, unheard, or unvalued. A victory Marcus had fought for, now defining Everett Airlines, shaping a culture of equity, kindness, and progress. A new policy stood at every gate, its letters bold and unapologetic: respect for all, an Everett promise, reflecting the progress Marcus had championed. A success resonating with passengers as they boarded, their faces relaxed, their voices warm, contrasting sharply with the strain that had once filled the air, signaling healing, renewal, and a new era, where honor was a right, not a privilege. A right Marcus had secured for all, a gift he had bestowed upon the world, enduring and uplifting others. Grace thrived in her new role as lead flight attendant, her quiet strength guiding the crew, her voice now heard in meetings where she advocated for equity, her words carrying the weight of her experience, the memory of that day fueling her determination to ensure no passenger faced prejudice again, lighting the path forward with kindness, equity, and progress. She shared stories of passengers who thanked her with kind words, their gratitude soothing her soul, a reminder of the impact she could have, an impact brought to life in the drawings children gave her during flights, their crayon sketches of planes and smiling faces pinned to a bulletin board in the crew room, a small gallery of kindness that reminded everyone of the difference they could make. A ripple starting with Grace's courage, spreading outward, touching lives, changing hearts, building a culture of care. A culture Marcus had envisioned, a culture Grace now helped to build, fostering warmth, connection, and humanity, enduring long after the flights ended. Marcus's heart swelled with gratitude each time he flew, each trip a reminder of the power of standing up, of the ripple effect one act of courage could have, an effect he saw in the way passengers now smiled with ease, their faces glowing with belonging, their voices warm with camaraderie, filling the cabin with a warmth that marked victory over prejudice, division, and for unity, honor, and love. A victory paying tribute to his father, his journey, his dream, a dream once impossible but now real, changing lives, radiating warmth, a beacon to the world that he would continue to shine, one flight, one story, one heart at a time. Marcus often reflected on the values his father had instilled, principles forged in the shadows of a system that overlooked him, a system Marcus had vowed to reshape when he started Everett Airlines, a vow tested that day on the plane but emerging stronger, guiding his every decision, a mission to his father, to himself, to the world, a mission to never stop fighting for equity, honor, and progress, a mission that defined him, drove him, and made him who he was, building a tradition of perseverance, integrity, and love that would live on, transform the world, one person, one flight, one story at a time. In a televised interview, Marcus sat in a sleek studio, his demeanor poised, the interviewer leaning forward, captivated by his presence, her eyes wide with interest as she asked, "Mr. Everett, your story has gone viral. What message do you want to send?" Marcus's gaze was steady, his voice clear, resonant, carrying the weight of his journey, the power of his vision, the depth of his heart. Speaking to millions, driving progress, issuing a call to action. "Respect is a right, not a privilege," he said, his words a declaration, a truth, a challenge to the world, to every viewer, to rise above prejudice, embrace dignity, and stand for what was right. A spark that could ignite a fire of progress, equity, and love. A fire Marcus had lit, burning brightly, spreading, and transforming. Everyone deserves dignity, no matter how they look or where they come from. True leadership is about setting that standard and ensuring it's upheld. He continued, his words a manifesto, a vision, a dream once his father's, his own, now a reality, changing lives, carrying warmth, courage, and progress. A reality that would endure, transform the world, one flight, one story, one heart at a time. The statement sparked conversations across social media, with hashtags like Respect for All and Everett Vision trending for days, encouraging others to share their stories of prejudice and resilience. A chorus of voices stretching beyond the skies, touching lives Marcus would never meet, lives transformed by sharing his experience, showing that equity could prevail, courage could succeed, progress was possible, a movement of warmth, equity, and love that Marcus had started, growing, transforming the world, building a tradition of bravery and heart that would live on, endure, in the stories shared, the lives touched, the hearts changed, a tradition Marcus had established, continuing to nurture, one flight, one story, one heart, at a time. Marcus smiled as he read the comments on his phone, a quiet glow in his eyes, reflecting a man who had turned pain into purpose, prejudice into progress, a moment into a movement that would live on, transform the world, resonate forever in the hearts of those who heard his story, in the lives of those who felt his impact, in the world he had changed, one flight, one story, one heart at a time. To everyone watching, Marcus had one last message, his voice steady as he spoke to the camera, his eyes carrying the scars of his journey, the glow of his efforts radiating warmth, triumph, and progress, a light that could guide the way, transform the world, a light Marcus had lit, shining brightly, enduring forever in the hearts of those who saw it, in the lives of those who felt it, in the world it touched, a light he would continue to share, one flight, one story, one heart at a time. If you've ever been made to feel like you don't belong, know your worth, stand tall and let them learn the hard way, he said, his words a call to action, a call to courage, a call to progress, a challenge to rise, to fight, to transform the world. A challenge Marcus had met, now passed on, enduring, transforming the world one story, one heart, one life at a time. Share your story in the comments, like this video, and subscribe for more tales of equity and perseverance.